This is a 2008 Ford Explorer Sport Trac Adrenalin, and it was a big deal back when it was on sale. This was part of a huge fad in the 2000s of four-door pickup truck SUV combos that excited everyone for a few years, and this is the ultimate version of the famous Sport Trac. Today, I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Explorer Sport Trac is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This Sport Trac is the one to have, a late model second generation Adrenalin with low mileage and the optional V8 that was very rare, and you can get this one on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Explorer Sport Trac, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Ford Explorer Sport Trac Adrenalin, starting with its biggest quirk, its mere existence. So, a little overview. The Sport Trac first came out for the 2001 model year, combining the practicality of a family SUV, the Explorer with its 4 doors and 2 rows of seats, plus a pickup truck bed. Now, in the early 2000s, the crew cab pickup for families hadn't really taken off yet. It wasn't really that common, and so this was a pretty big deal. The idea of a family pickup truck, and it started a fad in the early 2000s of vehicles like this. Chevy followed the next year with the Avalanche, which was a similar thing, a pickup truck with 4 full doors and sort of similar styling. Then Cadillac made a luxury version called the Escalade EXT, and a couple years later Honda came out with the Ridgeline, which was also the same basic idea, based on the SUV but with a pickup bed in back. It really was a big fad in the early 2000s, and the Explorer Sport Trac was the most popular and memorable of them all. Now, the Explorer Sport Trac was sold in 2 generations. This is a second-gen model, but the first-gen Sport Trac was by far the most common and popular. It was sold from 01 to 05, and it came out right at the start of this SUV truck fad, so it was a big deal when it launched. But that original Sport Trac was only offered with a V6, and quality was only okay. The second generation model came out for the 07 model year, heavily based on the new Ford Explorer that had just come out in 06. Quality was improved, and for the first time, the Sport Trac was offered with a V8, which this particular one has. It was a 4.6-liter V8 with just under 300 horsepower, which frankly was a pretty strong number for a mid-sized truck. Even still, it's a pretty strong figure, and especially back then. And a V8 in a mid-sized truck was muscular. Now, all of that stuff makes this particular Sport Trac especially exciting, a late model second generation with the V8, but there's more. This is a Sport Trac Adrenalin, like I mentioned. Now, it's not necessarily as cool as it sounds. The Adrenalin was initially conceived as a high-performance version of the Explorer Sport Trac. They were going to do this trim with a supercharged version of this engine with just under 400 horsepower, so an extra 100 horses over the V8. But this whole concept was being developed just as the Great Recession was taking hold in the late 2000s, and Ford created a new plan at that time to focus on the essentials, slim down the product line, and get rid of the extraneous low-volume special projects like a high-performance version of the Explorer Sport Trac. So the Adrenalin name lived on, but only as an option package that was mainly cosmetics. However, it was some cool cosmetics. The biggest change over a standard Sport Trac was the wheels. The Adrenalin got these 20-inch chrome wheels that were distinctive, and I always felt they looked pretty cool. The Adrenalin also got body-colored bumpers. This truck is black, so it has black bumpers, as you can see, and it has blacked-out headlights to add to the cool look, and a blacked-out front grille, again, to make it sleeker and stealthier. The Adrenalin also added these little vents on the front fenders to give it more of a high-performance look, even though they probably weren't really needed, and it included integrated running boards going down the side of the truck, again changed the look a little bit from the standard Sport Trac. And of course, you got the cool Adrenalin badge in back, as you can see, which made everybody know how cool you were. And that badge was carried over into the interior, although only on the floor mats. You got Adrenalin floor mats to, again, add to your cool factor with the special Sport Trac. But anyway, beyond the quirkiness of the Sport Trac, let's talk through the interesting exterior quirks and features, starting with the bed. Now, this truck was sold with, as you can see, a bed cover, which, well, it covers the bed, doesn't it? Now, it functioned fairly similar to a trunk. So you would come around to the back, you would flip up this little panel, there was a keyhole, you'd put the key in, twist it, and then you would open up this piece and open halfway to give you access to the bed. And so you could put stuff back there. In fact, this whole thing functioned so much like a trunk that government regulators thought it was one, and they made Ford put in a little emergency inside release so you couldn't kidnap anybody in your Sport Trac Adrenalin. But once you open up the bed cover, you can see it reveals this gate, like a fence in back. That is a bed extender. You put down the bed and then you flip the extender back and it gives you extra bed length if you were carrying larger items. That was a big deal in this truck in particular because it was a fairly short bed. In order to make it a mid-sized truck that was family friendly, could fit in garages, not a huge full-size pickup, they made the bed pretty small, but the extender added more length when you needed it. Now, this bed cover could, of course, also be completely removed if you wanted to. You can see the mechanism right here. You could take it entirely off, but most people left it on, so they had a trunk when they wanted and a bed when they wanted that instead. But anyway, next up, a couple of interesting things with getting into this truck. One is the keypad on the side. You had a little code that came with the truck that you could type in order to unlock or lock the doors. The thinking was if you were going for a swim or a run, you didn't want to bring your keys with you, you could lock them inside the truck and then just use the keypad to open the doors and you were done. It's a great idea. A lot of Ford models have it, and frankly, I think other brands should as well. The other notable thing about getting into this truck is the feel of the doors is surprisingly nice. I say surprising because Ford models throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, the quality wasn't especially great. And there's always this kind of ugly creaking feel to opening the doors. But by the late 2000s, as the recession started to take hold, Ford realized we got to tighten up, we got to make quality better. And so you can tell just by opening the doors that this was a lot better than the first generation Sport Trac and earlier Explorer-based vehicles. It just felt sturdier, better built, higher quality. Unfortunately, that wasn't really true of the interior. When you got inside the Sport Trac and looked around, you saw mostly cheap, low-grade materials in here. A lot of plastic, a lot of stuff that doesn't look that great or feel that great when you touch it. Ford may have improved their quality, and frankly, this interior doesn't creak or rattle when you drive the car, and so that's nice, but the physical materials you saw and touched and felt, looked at, just weren't particularly nice. Ford didn't really start to vastly improve the interior quality in the Explorer until the next generation model, which came out a few years later. But by then, they switched the Explorer from a body-on-frame truck-based SUV to a unibody crossover, and that meant that the Explorer Sport Trac had to go away. It was gone, and you never got a really great interior in this car. Now, with that said, the Adrenalin model did class things up a bit with a complete monochrome black interior. Other Sport Trac models had various different colors on different surfaces, but here it was all black, which does help to make it feel a little nicer inside. And beyond that, even though the quality may not have been the best, you did have some nice features in this interior. For example, power adjustable pedals. You would press this switch here and the pedals would automatically whir into the position that you wanted them to be in. You also had automatic headlights, which was a pretty nice luxury touch, especially for a mid-sized truck in this era. And you had Bluetooth phone connectivity, which really wasn't common in the late 2000s except in luxury cars, but you had it here in the Sport Trac. You also had steering wheel audio controls, as you can see here. It was a nice touch, a nice convenience feature that wasn't that common on vehicles like this at the time. And you had a power sunroof. You could press this, the sunroof would automatically open up, added a little more fun to your driving experience. Even more exciting was a power rear window. You can see this switch says rear glass. If you push that for down, the rear window lowers behind the back seats and adds some more airflow and kind of a cool touch in the interior. Of course, press it the other direction, the rear window rises back up again, and so you could open your rear glass in order to get more airflow in the interior. Some nice features in this car. And of course, there were a few interesting quirks. One that I always loved was the design of the door handle that you would pull to get out of the car. You can see the door panel here. There's no obvious door handle. It's this piece, this chrome piece at the end. You would sort of loop your hand around it, pull up, and open the door. I always thought it was a nice little bit of design, and the Explorer SUV from this era had the same thing. You also had kind of a quirky shift lever situation. It's completely vertical, sticking straight up this cylinder that's wrapped in leather. It gave it a bit of an interesting flair to the shifting, I suppose, and that added some quirk to the interior. More interesting, though, is this info button here in the center control stack. You would press that, and then it would cycle through various pieces of information in the gauge cluster screen. It was like your range, your fuel economy, nothing too unusual, but it did show you your all-time fuel used in gallons. So if you wanted to see how many gallons of fuel you had used over the entire life of the vehicle, you could do that. That's not something I've ever heard of anybody interested in finding out, but it was an available piece of information in this truck. Another unusual display in here, the climate controls, as you can see, pretty standard stuff, except there's a little button marked EXT. If you push that, the climate control temperature display switched to show the exterior temperature, which was kind of nice. And below that, you had another button marked FC, which of course would switch between Fahrenheit and Celsius. Interestingly, not just for the exterior temperature. It would also switch Fahrenheit to Celsius for the interior climate control temperature in case you wanted a quick look at what the Celsius or Fahrenheit version was. You just tap that button and there it was. Also, another somewhat interesting display. I always thought it was rather unusual that in the gauge cluster, the readout for fuel is sort of inset inside the gauge for the speedometer. And same deal on the other side, the temperature readout is inside the tachometer, which is kind of an unusual way of displaying that, but that's how it went in the Sport Trac and also in the Explorer SUV. And next we move on to the back seat in the Explorer Sport Trac, which was actually fairly large, all things considered. The front seat, the driver's seat, is positioned where I would sit. I'm pretty tall at 6'4", and I fit behind myself in this truck. Knee room, headroom, hip room. It's a little tight, but it's all here. And in fact, that was a big selling point of this vehicle. Again, you got the practicality of the Ford Explorer SUV, but also a truck bed for when you needed it. And this really came before the era where crew cab pickups became super popular. And so this was a pretty desirable configuration, having two real rows of seats and the truck bed, and still in a fairly reasonably sized package without getting some giant pickup truck with a giant interior and bed that you couldn't fit in your garage. It was good packaging, and that's one big reason why it was so popular. But anyway, back here, a couple of nice touches. For one, you got some cup holders on the back of the front center console, as you can see, and you also have climate vents back here. That would have been a big deal for a back seat of a pickup truck in the 2000s, and it gives you a good idea of just how focused on family use they were, that they were giving you climate vents and cup holders for rear seat passengers. In trucks back then, you got nothing. Of course, you also have leather seats back here, which is a nice touch, and that same cool interior door handle release, just like you had up front, carried on to the back, and that roll-down rear window, like I mentioned. And one other nifty little touch in the back seat. The seat backs would fold down completely on both sides. It was split, but you could fold it all the way down in case you wanted to create a flat surface in the back of the truck. Like if you wanted to get your muddy dog back here, you didn't want it on the leather, you could fold down the seats and do that. And over on the driver's side, the seat would fold down, and behind it there was a little storage cubby, which actually isn't really all that little. there's decent space back here for stuff. If you wanted some smaller item, you didn't want rolling around the interior, you had a little extra kind of hidden storage behind the back seat. But anyway, as you can see, a lot of interesting quirks. And another one is the driving experience. How does the Explorer Sport Trac feel on the road? Let's take it out and find out. All right, driving the Ford Explorer Sport Trac Adrenalin V8. This is, if you're gonna have an Explorer Sport Trac, the one to have. This car is so unusual and interesting, and I lived through it. I mean, when in the early 2000s, I was like 15, 13, 14, and this fad of these four-door trucks, the Avalanche and the Ridgeline, they all started to come out, and this was sort of the one that kicked it all off. So let's talk driving experience. I gotta say, I wasn't expecting this at all, but it's actually kind of nice to drive. The V8 is great. This V8 was pretty good. It's inefficient, it's old school, but judging it in the context of its time, it is a smooth, torquey V8. It was also relatively quiet considering it was a V8. This was actually a pretty well thought out, pretty well designed V8, and it does well in this car too, which doesn't surprise me. I also like the driving position. You're sitting nice and high. This does not have kind of the low crossover driving position that a lot of today's crossover SUVs do. It feels higher than that. It feels a little trucky, which is, I think, what people wanted when they were getting this. But at the same time, it feels more, you know, comfortable and luxurious than a truck. It has some nice features like I showed you with leather and power pedals and all the stuff that not a lot of trucks had, you know, back then 15 years ago. Interestingly, the ride quality is really not so bad, particularly compared with a truck. We're on a pretty bumpy road here, and you do feel bumps in the surface, and it's a little bit unsettled, like vehicles with beds tend to be, body-on-frame vehicles. However, the Explorer from this era was a body-on-frame vehicle, and it was also relatively unsettled. This feels better than pickup trucks from the mid-2000s, late 2000s. It certainly feels more comfortable. And I think that was part of the appeal of these trucks. Like you had a pickup because you wanted a pickup because you were like a suburban dad, you know that, but you really needed like an SUV. And before pickups kind of adapted to become family SUVs in a large way that they are now, that meant that that this was kind of the cool option. There goes a Rivian R1T, the spiritual successor to the Explorer Sport Trac. It's also relatively reasonably sized, and that was another big benefit of the Sport Trac compared to a lot of pickups, especially in that era that had, you know, if you wanted to get four doors, you had four doors, a long bed. It was not going to fit in your garage. This thing you could drive around, and you know, it was an Explorer for the family, but a truck for dad. It was good. Now, I will say the interior is a low point of this vehicle in terms of materials quality. All the American auto brands didn't do well in the 2000s in terms of their interiors, but I particularly was disappointed with this version of the Ford Explorer's interior. And they add some nice luxury features to this Sport Trac, but that doesn't make up for the materials quality issues that this interior has. It's fine, and it's fitting of the time period, but I will say it looks on the outside a lot nicer than it is on the inside. And frankly, I would submit that by this era, Ford was starting to get things right. Yes, the interior isn't great, but they were, after the mid-2000s, where all of the American automakers kind of let down the American public, by the late 2000s, the recession, potential bankruptcy, and bankruptcy for the other brands, they started to realize, hey, we gotta do better. And they did do better. And this truck was sort of from the era where they were beginning that do better process. Really, this is kind of a cool truck. I've always thought the Sport Trac looked cool, and it looked distinctive and head turning, and that was a big deal back in its era. It's a neat vehicle, and I really always did feel that way. Over time, I think the earlier models have not aged particularly well. The six-cylinder engine was kind of overmatched with that vehicle. The styling of the earlier ones wasn't as great. It's still not great by modern standards. There's no touchscreen in here. There's no great technology, adaptive cruise, all that stuff. But it really was kind of the ultimate iteration of this car and the best. It still looked cool and distinctive and interesting, but it was sort of the most modern, most evolved version of this. This four-door truck SUV became a brief fad, and to me, the Sport Trac was always the vehicle that represented it kind of the most obviously. Like this was the most popular and the original and sort of the most emblematic of its era. And this is the best version of that. And so that's the 2008 Ford Explorer Sport Trac Adrenalin with the rare big V8 up front. This really was a special and highly desired car back in its day, and it's hard to find one in such nice shape now, but you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Sport Trac a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 40 out of 100, which puts the Explorer Sport Trac Adrenalin here against some other sort of similar trucks. The Sport Trac started a trend in its era, and the V8-powered Adrenalin was the very best version of it. Even today, it's reasonably practical, with room for a family plus a pickup bed in the back, and the V8 is surprisingly smooth and powerful. Drawbacks are interior quality, fuel economy, and technology, but overall, this truck provides a surprisingly good value for the money.